In February 1942, Rear Admiral Doorman gripped the bridge rail as his cruiser plunged through the black, oil-slick water of Bali Strait. Salt spray stung his face and the ship's timbers groaned under strain, every sound magnified in the night. His fleet was a fragile mosaic, vessels and men drawn from Dutch, American, British, and Australian services, each crew reading different signals and following different doctrines. Dutch codebooks sat beside American formation charts, British radio nets burbled in unfamiliar channels, and Australian tactical notes were posted where everyone could see them. The whole thing felt improvised, held together by will more than by plans, with the single urgent purpose of keeping Java in Allied hands. Through his binoculars, Doorman could see the enemy, Japanese destroyers moving fast and low, black against the lighter silhouette of Bali. When his lead cruiser fired, there was the brief punctuation of muzzle flash, a white bloom that vanished almost at once. For a dizzy second, the darkness was cut, then swallowed. 20 seconds later, the warning came too late. Type 93 torpedoes streaked toward them like thin, deadly comets. A Japanese searchlight picked out the cruiser's profile and hot metal shredded the bridge rail. Men dove for any cover they could find. Doorman lowered his binoculars, tasting metal and smoke in the air, as the Imperial Navy across the water choreographed its attack with a terrible, machine-like precision. His own ships recoiled and scattered like startled birds. One of them went dark, another listed, and the untested alliance that had been hurried into being was no longer merely failing. It had become a trap with teeth. Pearl Harbor had thrown open a new front, and the aftershock still reverberated. Japanese forces moved south like a tide with an obvious target in mind: the oil-rich Netherlands East Indies. That oil was more than fuel. It was the artery that fed Japan's campaigns in China and the wider war machine. Without it, Japan's operations would sputter. With it, they could sustain a sweeping push across Southeast Asia. The Allies responded with haste. The United States, Britain, the Netherlands, and Australia stitched together a joint command known by the unwieldy acronym ABDA. On paper, ABDA was the answer. In practice, it was a patchwork of competing priorities, language barriers, and equipment that wasn't designed to talk to one another. Ships were sent where commanders thought they were needed, messages crossed and recrossed each other, and the precious commodity of time slipped away. While plans were argued over, Japanese forces seized the initiative. Manila fell. British Malaya was overrun. Singapore surrendered in a blow that stunned the Allies, and the bombing of Darwin on February 19, 1942, devastated the northern Australian port, destroying supplies and installations, and making the scale of the Japanese threat painfully real. Java loomed as the Allies' last major anchor in the area, a crux point for supply lines and a staging ground for any counter-effort to blunt Japan's push. Aircraft routes from Australia to Java depended on a string of forward airfields. If that chain was severed, resupply and reinforcement would become vastly more difficult. Initially, the Japanese focused elsewhere, but storms and operational setbacks forced them to shift attention to a smaller, overlooked prize, Denpasar Airfield on Bali, barely 2 miles from Java. Capturing that airfield would permit continuous air operations against Allied positions on Java, allow interdiction of shipping, and render the sea lanes into a killing field for slow-moving transports. It was a bold calculation. If the Allies moved swiftly and with coordinated force, the narrow channels and shallow waters around Bali could turn the invaders' plan into disaster. But speed was Japan's advantage. Surprise and nighttime tactics were their tools. On the night of February 17, 1942, an invasion force slipped out of Makassar, carrying troops and equipment intended for a lightning seizure of Denpasar. 2 transports, Sasagago Maru and Sagami Maru, carried elements of the 1st Formosa Infantry Regiment of the 48th Division, along with engineers, mountain guns, and signals detachments requisitioned from other theaters, because shipping was limited. Escorting them were destroyers built for the long, dark work of night fighting, fast, heavily armed, and carrying the Type 93 torpedoes, the so-called Long Lance, that had greater range and catastrophic power compared with many Allied weapons of the time. These ships did their training in radio silence and moonless conditions. They were designed to hunt in the same kind of black the Allied captains now found themselves in. ABDA reconnaissance units picked up the convoy, but the precise objective was not immediately clear. In the fog of war, many guesses were made and few were certain. On Java, assets were scrambled. At Surabaya, the Dutch cruiser Tromp readied to move, while along the southern coast, destroyers and cruisers took their stations in an attempt to cover possible approaches. Among them were vessels carrying names that would later be scrawled into the reports and after-action accounts. Ships that were brave in ways the paperwork could never fully convey. The flagship of the hastily assembled Abda force rode the uneasy swells of anticipation and dread. Doorman's ship, crowded with officers trying to hammer a plan into a pile of fragments, became the fulcrum of a desperate gamble. Doorman himself was a study in focused exhaustion. He had been one of the early naval aviators, cutting his teeth in the air before an injury grounded him and sent him back to sea. Even after that transition, his mind remained shaped by the coordination and fast decision-making the aviator's prize. He had a reputation for pulling disparate pieces together with an economy of motion, short orders, clear priorities, and a calm that could steel crews for the worst. By 1940, he had worked his way to Rear Admiral, shepherding the remnant of Dutch naval power through a world that had already been rewritten by conquest. When Abda needed a leader, Doorman's name was one of the few that fit, experienced, battle-hardened, and willing to take on a task that many thought impossible. Faced with superior enemy numbers and a shrinking window, Doorman ordered every available vessel toward Bali Strait with little more than compass bearings and a hope for cohesion. There was no time to gather the scattered intelligence into a single clear picture. There was only the decision to move and the trust that crews would follow orders. The fleet steamed into the strait like a thin thread stretched over a blade, vulnerability wrapped inside resolve. Crews worked in tense silence, engines a steady bass note under the sharper sounds of commands and the occasional radio burst. Men checked weapons, laced their boots tighter, and wondered in private moments between watch shifts which of them would see the next dawn. As the night wore on, the confrontation intensified. Flashes of gunfire painted brief theatrical scenes on the water, while the steady, stealthy advance of Japanese torpedo attacks took their toll. Ships were disabled, some caught and hauled away into the darkness, others slowed and left with heavy lists. Damage control parties ran along decks testing pumps and shoring up bulkheads. In those hours, the thin line between salvageable and lost was the speed of a few men with hammers and intact pipes. Overhead, planes, if and when they came, moved in ragged arcs, their presence a fleeting hope. When communication lines broke, small units improvised using flag, lamp, or shouted word to try and keep the semblance of order. By dawn, the toll was evident. Smoke rose where ships had taken hits, and the sea bore the detritus of machines and bodies. The strategic picture had shifted yet again. What had been an attempt to block a small, decisive move now revealed the limits of hurried alliances facing a prepared and focused opponent. For Doorman and his crews, the night was a brutal teacher. Courage was not always enough when faced with better intelligence, superior coordination, and weapons designed for the conditions they had chosen. Yet even in retreat or defeat, there were moments of quiet valor. Men bandaging strangers, stokers keeping boilers alive, junior officers running messages between damaged compartments. Tiny acts that make history more human than any map or plan. In the weeks that followed, Java would be tested again and again, its ports and airfields becoming the ground on which larger calculations were made. The loss of the air route through Bali would prove decisive in the wider campaign, and the events in Bali Strait would be read and reread by commanders seeking lessons. For those who had been there, the memory was less about doctrine and more about the feel of cold metal, the sudden flash of searchlights, the smell of burning cordite, and the faces of the men who had stood beside them when things went wrong. The story of that night is a small thread in a vast tapestry of wartime decisions and human endurance, one in which improvisation and hope collided with preparation and ruthlessness, and where a handful of choices reshaped the fate of islands, empires, and the men who took orders and acted on them. As Japan tightened the noose, Doorman's earlier victories meant nothing. He went into the fight with a scattered, half-ready force and no real way to win. 3 separate strike waves were to converge on Bali from different directions. The first wave, Reuter, Java, Piet Hein, Pope, and John D. Ford, left Gillett Jop on February 18th and charged toward Bali Strait. At Surabaya, the second wave formed, American destroyers, Stuart, John D. Edwards, and Pillsbury joined the Dutch cruiser Tromp after a quick refuel at Retai Bay. The third wave consisted of 8 Dutch motor torpedo boats. One was forced into dry dock after sinking a buoy, while the remaining boats refueled at Pang Pang Bay and headed for Bali on the morning of the 19th. Doorman's plan relied on urgency. Each wave would strike independently, the first to enter Bali Strait from the south shortly after midnight on February 19th. But the Japanese were already ashore. Troops had landed near Denpasar and the operation was nearly complete. The main Japanese force remained in the Banda Sea, leaving Destroyer Division 8, Asashio, Oshio, Arashio, and Michio to cover the transports. Before the cruisers and destroyers could close, 2 ABDA submarines were tasked to set things in motion. Seawolf and Truant were the only boats in position to strike Bali directly while surface forces scrambled to catch up. At 2 a.m. on February 18th, Seawolf slipped through Bali Strait on the surface. Radar soon showed Japanese ships approaching. Seawolf edged past the outer screen of destroyers until a lookout spotted suspicious wakes, forcing her to dive and run silent at periscope depth. Navigation proved treacherous. The shifting currents and poor charts made pinpointing position almost impossible, and by daybreak visibility all but vanished, leaving only distant silhouettes to guide the approach. Seawolf lurched to a halt when she grounded, backed off, tried again, and grounded worse. Several attempts to break free failed, and with the convoy only miles away, the sub took a gamble, blew ballast, and surfaced. A rain squall arrived just as Seawolf broke the waves. Under its cover, she maneuvered inside the convoy for nearly 30 minutes. When the rain cleared, Seawolf submerged, turned to bring her stern tubes to bear, and fired 2 torpedoes. 2 distant explosions followed. The Japanese counterattacked with depth charges that rained down and rocked the hull in the shallow waters of the strait. Seawolf ran silent and hugged the bottom while the pounding continued for hours. She survived with no major damage. The torpedoes had either exploded prematurely or struck harmlessly ashore, a reminder of the high failure rates that plagued U.S. torpedoes at the time. As Seawolf slipped away, Truant arrived from Soraya mid-morning without warning of Seawolf's presence. Truant never entered Bali Strait but intercepted part of the Japanese covering force, Nagara and her escorts, undetected, slipped inside the screen, and fired a full spread of 6 torpedoes at Nagara. All missed. Truant dove, evaded the counterattack, and withdrew to Surabaya under threat of pursuit. The mission had failed. No hits, no second chance. Meanwhile, Allied bombers were forming over Java. 13 heavy bombers and 7 Douglas A-24 Banshee dive bombers were launched. The first formations arriving over Denpasar just after 7 a.m. 18 separate bombing runs were flown before dusk. Bomb bay doors opening over landing craft, transports, and shoreline positions. The heavies dropped 500 and 1,000-pound general-purpose bombs from altitude to battleships and beachheads, while the A-24s dove low, releasing armor-piercing bombs meant to punch decks before detonating. Pilots reported multiple hits, 4 direct strikes and a dozen near misses, and claimed 2 transports sunk and a destroyer crippled. In reality, damage was limited. Only Sagami Maru suffered a critical hit when a bomb penetrated her upper deck and exploded in the engine room, disabling but not sinking her. The invasion force already ashore pressed its advance unopposed. Defenders and deserters, exhaustion and courage. The small 600-man militia that had once stood ready to meet the threat saw its morale collapse as Japanese troops closed in, and many of its members made the grim choice to flee or surrender rather than face overwhelming odds. The defense crumbled not from a single failure, but from the grinding combination of surprise landings, failed torpedo attacks, limited bombing results, fractured command, and the sheer momentum of a well-timed invasion. Deserters scattered into the hills, rifles abandoned in the scrub, while their Dutch commander paced the ruined command post, helpless and furious as one by one his men walked away from their posts. A demolition order to wreck Denpasar airfield the night before had been misread by the engineer detachment. What should have been a timed, violent blackout was delayed on paper, and when Japanese troops rolled onto the runway, they found it whole and ready. A smooth ribbon of concrete that invited aircraft rather than denying them. By midday, the invaders controlled Bali and its airstrip, the fragile air corridor to Java exposed and gaping, with unloading finished and transports lightening their decks. The covering force steamed back toward open water, 4 destroyers lingering to tend the crippled Sagami Maru and the damaged Sasaga Maru, while the rest pushed north. Lookouts on the Abida cruisers, strained eyes cutting the black, caught the first hints of movement, shadows that might have been fishing boats or might have been death, and then Java's searchlights flared. Star shells bloomed, and the first salvos cracked the night. In seconds, the calm sea became a stage of violent geometry. Shells stitched white arcs through smoke, tracer braided the black, and the Japanese destroyers that had left their transports flashed away from the beaches and lunged at the Allied line, executing an old, practiced maneuver to cross the column and rake it with torpedoes and guns. Doorman's cruisers answered, thinking they had found transports and landing craft. Belief hardened into action, and in the confusion, the Dutch ships fired full broadsides at targets misidentified by moonless night and haste. For a few cruel minutes, both sides thought they had the upper hand. Cruisers reported strikes. Lookouts cheered at lights and gore, but the Japanese, trained for nocturnal hunting and armed with Type 93 torpedoes and guns sighted for these conditions, took blows and kept going as if the night itself powered them. A 5-inch shell punched through Java's midsection and set fires that damage control fought with desperate skill while the ship kept moving. Elsewhere, small fires licked at paint and canvas, and men worked with pails and pumps, the steady rhythm of firefighting a counterpoint to the sudden bright violence of explosions. When the cruisers pulled back, believing they had hit hard enough, the destroyer action farther astern turned from chance to carnage. Piet Hein and her American partners zigzagged and laid smoke in a bid to seize firing angles, to launch torpedoes that might silence the Japanese escorts. But Asashio and Oshio answered with disciplined, lethal salvos that found plates and pipes. One round smashed through Piet Hein's searchlight platform. Another ripped into her aft engine room and severed the main steam line. Steaming stopped, lights died, pumps stuttered, and flames poured through her midships as men shouted to one another over the din. The Japanese closed, and in a handful of seconds a spread of torpedoes found flesh. Piet Hein went down almost instantly, the lieutenant commander going with her as hull and steel folded beneath the Black Sea. Survivors flailed in a slick of oil and blood. Passing destroyers cut the water with machine gun fire as if to finish the scene, and the small corks of life jackets bobbed among the wreckage until the cold and the current took them. On the remaining decks, the mood hardened into grim efficiency. Damage control parties worked like clockwork to save what could be saved. Surgeons and medics wrestled with burns and shrapnel, and junior officers ran along the decks relaying orders in clipped voices because the radios were unreliable and the charts were barely legible. Signals that should have been simple, course changes, concentrated fire, a request for air cover, were mangled by static and language, and the tactical advantage bled away every minute the fleets failed to act as one. The night's short fury exposed the deadly arithmetic of the campaign. Hurried plans, misread orders, and a force stitched together from different navies could not match an enemy that had rehearsed the night and shaped its weapons to match the dark. When quiet finally returned, it had the weight of loss. Ships listing or dead in the water, small groups of survivors clinging to rafts or the flotsam of their own lives, decks slick with oil and salt, and the sharp metallic smell of cordite and burned paint lingering like a promise that the next engagement would come sooner than anyone could bear. The tactical consequences were immediate. With Bali secured and the Japanese destroyers proving their mastery of night tactics, the Allied attempt to blunt the invasion route had failed spectacularly, leaving Java more vulnerable than before and forcing commanders to reckon with the brutal fact that courage, even in large quantities, could not substitute for coordination, clear orders, and weapons suited to the kind of war the Japanese had chosen to fight. For Pope and John D. Ford, the situation shifted violently and suddenly. Originally ordered to continue up the strait and engage enemy ships, they now found themselves isolated against 2 aggressive destroyers and forced into a desperate escape. As John D. Ford opened fire on Asashio, Oshio remained hidden behind Piet Hein's smoke, and the Americans turned south in a wide arc trying to circle back north while smoke generators ran hot and shells stitched the narrow channel. The Japanese pressed hard, tightening the angle until the 4 ships locked into parallel courses, and Pope and John D. Ford were engaged in a running gun duel with Asashio and Oshio. Torpedoes were launched and splashes rose, but accuracy slipped in the dark and both sides missed. Then came a risky move. Pope and John D. Ford made a sharp turn to port, cutting directly across the Japanese bows and bringing them perilously close for a brief, brutal exchange at point-blank range. Running out of options, Pope fired 5 torpedoes wide to force the enemy offline, and John D. Ford dropped a smokescreen across her stern. And for a moment the ruse worked. The Japanese hesitated, and the American destroyers disengaged at full speed, steering south with every crewman alert for a chasing torpedo. As Oshio turned north, a ship loomed ahead and opened fire. For agonizing minutes, Oshio and Asashio exchanged muzzle flashes and salvos, each convinced they were targeting a new Allied vessel. And when the smoke cleared, the horrifying truth emerged. They had been firing on their own. Each Japanese ship later claimed to have sunk an enemy destroyer, while neither acknowledged the friendly fire mistake in official logs. No damage resulted from that particular chaos, but by then Pope and John D. Ford were already gone. Further north, Horatio and Michio had just exited the strait when the contact report reached them. Kubo's orders were direct to return to the battle, but they were too far out, and the backtrack would take too long, so they missed the entire first phase of the engagement, and most of the second. Kubo's main force reversed course as well, racing back toward Bali at full speed. The Allies had struck briefly and violently, and the remaining Japanese waves were already moving into place. The second wave of Abda ships surged around Bali's southern tip just after 1 a.m. on February 20th, and Stuart's commander tried repeatedly to raise Pope and John D. Ford by radio, but heard only silence while flares and explosions lit the black coastline ahead. The destroyers pressed on without waiting, Tromp hanging back to cover the rear alone. 2 enemy destroyers were already circling, and as the Allied column raced north at 20 knots green lights, blinked from ahead, signals in a multinational force were often unclear, and that confusion carried a price. Torpedoes fired to port. Stuart and Parrott launched 6 each. Pillsbury 3, aimed at Asashio and Oshio guarding the transport anchorage in Sundur Roads, but in the flat, calm water the torpedo wakes glowed like arrows, and both destroyers swung clear. Minutes crawled until at 1:36 a.m. Stuart made contact and fired star shells and torpedoes, while John D. Edwards tried to launch a 4-torpedo spread, only to have 2 jam. And when Asashio and Oshio closed their first salvo, straddled Stuart before a shell hit and ricocheted, wounding the executive officer, and another slammed the steering engine room, crippling the ship. Stuart shuddered, lost control. Parrott barely avoided collision. John D. Edwards veered hard to starboard, and Pillsbury peeled off toward the eastern shore. Mayhem spread as Japanese shells chased the formation north. Stuart regained partial steering through auxiliary control and clawed forward while John D. Edwards tucked in behind and Parrott resumed to port. Pillsbury now separated and angling east to link with Tromp. The torpedo assault had failed. Rather than crippling the transports at Sono Roads, Doorman's Allied force had been scattered, and Asashio and Oshio swung southeast to isolate Pillsbury and make a run at Tromp. Tromp powered through the strait with guns ready and flicked on a massive blue searchlight that painted her hull and the sea. At 2:07 a.m., Japanese guns opened up on the glowing target. Shells smashed into Tromp's upper works. The navigation bridge was smashed, the fire control director destroyed. Fires broke out, and below decks engineers battled flooding from a hit below the waterline. Oshio sent torpedoes that Tromp narrowly dodged. Crewmen fell across decks. 8 enlisted men were killed instantly, and more than 24 wounded, yet Tromp kept fighting, returning fire with a barrage that in 6 minutes sent 71 shells and hundreds of 40mm rounds toward the attackers, and even scored a hit on Oshio that took several men out of the fight. The Japanese destroyers, however, held formation and then abruptly broke off to protect the transport Sagami Maru. Their original charge, and Tromp burning and battered, linked with Pillsbury and turned north as the Allies began to withdraw. Just when the cruiser's captain, wounded and low on ammunition, assumed the battle was over, 2 more Japanese destroyers, Horatio and Michio, slid into the northern end of the strait, having detached earlier from escort duty and now rushing south. Their arrival was a complete surprise, and the ABDA formation, still disorganized, faced the terrifying prospect that the night's fight was far from finished.